Hello and welcome to another video by AIA Contract Documents. My name is Mike Koger. I'm an attorney with AIA Contract Documents program. I'm going to be joined on this video by Tara Myers, Sal Verastro, and Chris Lasky. All three of whom are Documents Committee members who have been working very diligently over the last year and a half to create a set of documents for situations when there are two architects providing services on a project. Those two documents, well, at least the two core documents, are the B111-2022 Owner Design Architect Agreement and the B112-2022 Owner Architect of Record Agreement. And there are a handful of exhibits that correspond to those documents, most notably the E205 responsibility matrix. That can be used as a tool to parse out the scope of services between the two architects. One thing I have to say before we start talking any further is that when we can't provide legal advice on this video, we're certainly going to be talking about some legal topics. But if you have any questions or that are specific to your project or to an issue that you're encountering, we always advise that folks contact someone in their jurisdiction who's an attorney who can help weigh in on those. So Tara, Chris, and Sal, thanks for joining me on this one. This video, we're going to be talking about some pretty interesting issues that really get into the weeds of how two architects work together on a project. First of all, how they coordinate their services and make sure that there are no scope gaps and what their relative responsibilities are in that regard. And then also the issue of what can an architect of record rely on with regard to the design submissions and the information it gets from the design architect. Which is always kind of an interesting issue. And then lastly, we're going to be talking about how design consultants, folks like the structural engineer, the MEP engineers, are handled on these kinds of projects. And we'll talk a little bit about each of your experiences, but then also talk about how we've handled these issues in the contracts that we are publishing. So I think let's go ahead and start with the issue of when you got two architects working on a project, a design architect and architect of record, how are they supposed to coordinate their services and make sure that nothing falls between the cracks or that the two architects are doing a whole bunch of redundant services? Tara, I'll go ahead and start with you. What do you, I know your firm's done a handful of these types of projects. How do you guys treat this issue?
Well, and I'll start off by saying, well, good morning. I'll start off by saying that, and thank you for having us here together to talk about all these things, because I think we have gained a lot of great insights and knowledge from our collective group over the last year and a half, and talking with outside liaisons and really understanding these topics. And so from our personal experience in our firm, there's a couple of ways that these arrangements can happen. When we have another architect that works for us or we work for them, there's one set of kind of situation when we put our team together, or when you have two separate architects that are both working for the owner, there's a completely different set of rules that come into play. And I think with that second one, particularly, there's a chance that you could have these gaps in the scope where the owner is not getting this full set of services that are anticipated, that when they're hiring one architect, they are looking to one person or one firm to pull that off. And in this case, they've got two separate groups. So we've used responsibility matrices of various sizes, shapes, and colors, and they come in a lot of different forms. And I think there is no industry standard for that. And that's been one challenge that we've had. It's just how do you take all these responsibilities on a project and parse it out between two different firms. So from our history, we've used a lot of different techniques. I think one thing that I really appreciated about this group is how we've been trying to take the basic services that an architect provides under, say, a B101, B103 contract, and say, okay, how are we going to divide these up and make sure that the owner doesn't have any holes, and that the architects then can have a discussion about who's going to provide what services on the project.
Gotcha. So it definitely matters, the contract structure matters, right? So if they're a consultant, if you've got, for example, a design architect as a consultant to you as the architect of record, that might be different than if you had independent contracts. And I should say that the B111 and the B112 are the scenario where you have independent contracts. So we'll pull up some language that we've crafted that gets to coordination. Like, Tara, do you just consider when you're working with another architect, are they just another consultant, or do you have to do you have to have further meetings and more collaboration with them because you're working really in the same arena, in the same field?
I think it's a lot more complicated than if you're working with your structural engineer or with your mechanical engineer, because in those situations you've got completely different fields of expertise, and they're going to take on one area and you've got your own lane that you're going to run in, and you have your moments of coordination, but they're very different. And when you're working with another architect, you are, in a lot of cases, you're coming to the table with the same set of skills. You may not hopefully have the same weaknesses and the same strengths, because you really want to complement each other, but you got to make sure that you know who's doing what, and you're not just assuming, well, I'm doing this phase, so that means that I've got this set of services, but I may not think about everything involved with that phase because I'm so naturally in tune to doing it for my own firm. I need to make sure that everybody's on the same page and we're communicating up front who's going to do what.
Sal, I know you've done a number of these projects or been a part of them as well. What's your experience with the coordination issue? What are some of the ways in which you get around that or work it, make sure that you've got your services coordinated between the other architects you're working with?
That's a great question, and I'm glad you asked Tara first, because she's obviously a larger firm, where I'm on the other end of the spectrum, where I have a smaller firm. So we've actually had some issues with this, where we were either teamed up or a forced marriage with another firm. And typically the problems that we've seen is just what Tara mentioned, is dividing up those services, who does what. Without a responsibility matrix, it's basically the easiest thing to do is to clean cut it, where one firm does schematic design or design development, and then it's stopped and there's a handoff, and the architect of record, the AOR, picks it up from that point on, whether we're working for the owner independently or together under one contract. It does make a difference. But so having worked on these documents, the best thing that came out of this, the silver lining for me, is this responsibility matrix, which is a blessing in disguise, the E205, as you mentioned. For a small firm like mine, it's gold, because now we can sit down with something. We have a framework where we can work with another architect instead of clean cutting it, which is fine. If one firm wants to just do schematic design, that's fine, but there's no gaps then, or very little. You're trying to reduce the amount of gaps. It's all about risk management, so that the owner doesn't have any issues. And as an architect, you can set your fees accordingly, because otherwise you're just flapping in the breeze, and there's finger pointing later on. And the other thing I think is really important how we coordinate is the firms have to have mutual respect for each other and a trust factor. There's a trust factor involved. If you have a lot of experience with that other firm, it's a little bit easier. But if it's a forced marriage where you've never worked with them, it makes things more difficult, and that's where the responsibility matrix makes things a lot easier. What we prefer, the blended project delivery method, where both firms are still involved from beginning to end instead of a clean handoff. I think that makes it a lot easier to coordinate services. In my mind, you're always involved. Both firms can offer their advice along the way, but obviously it always comes down to fee. Who's going to get paid what, and you want to do the least amount of work for the most amount of money, it seems like. But in the end, you want to give the owner the best project you possibly can. So for a small firm, this is vital. I think the responsibility matrix is a godsend.
Chris, I want to bring you into the discussion. Of course, you're an architect by training, but you also work in kind of the owner developers side of the equation. When it comes to coordination between the two architects, I'm kind of curious. Do you even care? Or do you just say, hey, I just want you guys to do what your scope of work is, and you all deal with it on your own.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for having us here. I think this is a very timely conversation with what's going on in the architects and construction industry. But to back up a second, I think that having two separate firms involved in a project isn't new. I think people have been doing this for some time. I think that the challenge has been that you're sort of reinventing the wheel every time, talking to these two firms, figuring out, you know, who's going to be doing what. My group, my company is probably more on the higher sophistication level, and we sort of understand these relationships a little bit better. The responsibility matrix, however, is such a useful tool as a starting point, then to be able to say, you know, who is the, you know, to Sal's point, there is that clean cut in that transfer package, as it's called. But there's also that way to sort of blend those services together and see who might be the stronger firm to perform specific duties. You know, I've always been of the belief that the risk should be attributed to those best able to mitigate it. So this allows you to walk through all these services and see who's the best party to perform those. The other end of it is that, you know, smaller architectural firms or maybe less sophisticated architectural firms may see partnering up with a larger firm or a firm that they don't know at the request of the owner or just out of necessity as a daunting task. And I think that these documents help to take a little mystery away from that and to give some comfort in not just the individual architectural firms, but with the owner that you know, the basic scope of services is being taken care of. To Tara's point, you know, we don't have gaps in the service. We're not paying twice for the same service. I think it's a really good starting point to give comfort that there will be a complete project at the end of this. So I think, circling back to your initial question, it is critical, in my view, that the owner understands exactly who's providing what. And to Sal's point, you know, trying to you know, do the amount of work and get paid as much as you can for it. As an owner, I would say that there is the we always believe in a fair pay for a fair amount of work, and these documents make that transparent.
Yeah, that's a good point. We've talked, you know, in other sessions that we've done about that E205. I can see from an owner's perspective, if you're attaching that common exhibit to both of your design architect and architect of record agreements, you can very easily see who's going to be responsible for what. It's not as, you know, I can imagine some relationships where it's a little bit murkier from the owner's perspective as to who's doing what. With a responsibility matrix, that's really a little bit easier to kind of pick up on that. I'm going to share some language that is in our agreement, but the first thing I'm going to do is close out my email. We'll cut that out, this video. Sorry. About the coordination responsibility. So I'm going to share some language that we have. This is pretty standard in our B100 series owner architect agreements, but it's something that, while it's in every agreement, it definitely matters more here when you've got two architects working on a project. Okay. Okay, and this is the language in just a moment. In section 3.12. So this is the architect of record agreement, the B112, and it, you know, in the first sentence says the architect of record shall coordinate its services with those services provided by the owner and the owner's consultants, including the design architect. No surprise, if you look at the B111, it has the exact same language. It's just reciprocal. So it is really both. I mean, at least the way that we've envisioned this to work is you've got all parties kind of reaching out to each other to coordinate their services, and specifically here, the architect of record and the design architect both reaching towards each other to work together. That's that's when it comes down to the tangible aspects of actually coordinating services, that's when the responsibility matrix is particularly helpful. Any thoughts on this language? I know we didn't talk about it a ton when we developed it because it is so common to our owner-architect agreements. Any thoughts on this before we start to move on to the next issue of right to rely on information provided by the design architect?
I'll just add that I think that the language is well written, and while they're two architects, we can rely on each other's information. It's obviously the AOR has to rely on the information that's handed down to him from the design architect for the most part, since they're on the job initially. But that being said, the AOR is responsible. They're the architect of record. They're responsible for this project, and they have to do their due diligence because they're 100% responsible for the construction documents, and it would not be prudent for them to ignore their due diligence and just totally rely on documents, because everyone makes mistakes. Again, we go back to there's a trust factor involved here, but you have to do your due diligence and make sure you look at everything like you normally would on any other project for accuracy and completeness.
So have either of you three, I'm going to guess maybe all three of you have been in this role when it comes to, have you been in a role where you're an architect of record and you've gotten design submissions, whether it's a schematic design or a DD set, from a design architect, and then had to figure out, well, what in this bundle of design documents can I rely on, and what do I have to double check? I assume all of you, have you all been in that role before?
Yes.
Does anyone want to raise their hand and give me their initial shot at, like, well, what do you think you can rely on it for, and what do you have to double check? Tara.
I can jump in there. And this is always one of those challenges when you start off on the project, because especially if you weren't involved in those initial conversations with the owner, maybe you didn't develop the program. Maybe the other architect developed the program, or they were handed it from the owner, but they at least had all those meetings and conversations to validate the program. And maybe you weren't involved with the initial code analysis, but in the end, as you guys have just pointed out, if you're the architect of record, you're stamping and signing those drawings, and you are ultimately responsible for the code. So there are things like initial programming, things that are in there that I want to make sure that the big picture, there's further development of the program, maybe the lighting and the security and the hardware and those things that we're going to have conversations about as we continue to develop the design. But I'm hoping that the number of patient beds or the number of classrooms or whatever this program element is, that those things have been fleshed out, and that what has been put onto paper has been thought out by the design architect and approved by the owner at that point. So I'm hoping I can rely on those big picture things. And I know that then our firm is going to have to really get into the weeds with the codes and the details and the things that come after that. So I think there's this kind of maybe division between the big picture items and then the more detailed refinement of that comes along as we finalize the design.
Yeah, I'll add on that a little bit that, you have no contractual relationship here between the design architect and the architect of record, right? So they both have prime contracts with the owner, and as such, it in my view, it falls on the owner to verify that the design architect's work product conforms with the needs of the project, that the program's met, understanding that there's going to be further development from it, but being able to validate the program as the architect of record starts its work, I think is critical for obvious reasons. You don't want to, as an owner, you don't want to pay for the same services twice, and so you have that. But conversely, when you to Tara's point, the AOR is responsible in the end for a complete package, and there are certain jurisdictional hurdles and compliance that really fall completely on the AOR's shoulders, regardless of how much work the design architect has done to fulfill those obligations. We still see it as the AOR's squarely on their shoulders, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, Chris, because so there's two roads we can take here. Assuming that the AOR and the DA were involved in the project from the get-go, I think there's a little bit more of a comfort level and less risk management that's involved, and we can rely on those documents because we have been involved in the project from the get-go, and we should have been involved enough to feel comfortable receiving those documents at some point. Yes, we still have to do our due diligence. 100%, it's on the AOR. Got it. It's the problems that occur when you're just handed the package, the DD package or the SD package, cold call, so to speak, and you weren't involved in it. And to Chris's point, the owner wants a fee proposal from let's just say CDs on, and because they don't want to pay for DDs again, and they don't want to pay for you to go back and look at the program and check everything, and particularly existing dimensions, if that, or dimensions that are shown on a site plan or something like that. And that's where the crux comes in, because the owners are like, you can rely on these, and if we do, and something happens, that's where the problems arise. And I feel very uncomfortable taking a package like that and leaning on an owner and saying that I'm going to rely on this 100%, but it's all on you. That's a difficult road to cross, and I don't think owners like to hear that, particularly when the problems arise. I think we're responsible for, to some extent, to do our due diligence. So it depends on the handoff, so to speak, and how the involvement of the AOR.
I'm going to add on to that, Sal. I think you bring up a really good point. I've had some owners who picture or who have described the AOR as more of a drafting service, who just feel like, okay, I've got my design here. I had this other architect establish this. They've done all their codes, and you just need to draft it. I just need you to get me a permit set to get this through the codes. And really, based on our licensing, and at least in the states that I'm licensed in and our firm's licensed in, that's not the role of the architect of record. They have to be responsible for that complete design. And so I think part of it is an education to people to say, look, this is more than a drafting service. This is a continuation of the design, and it's a verification that it is meeting those health, safety, and welfare criteria that are, ingrained in our licensure as architects. I think that's an important distinction to make, is that the roles between the design architect and the architect of record, there is that review of codes and laws and regulations that has to fall under the AOR.
Yeah, and Tara, that's something I'm still sharing my screen, so I want to point to some language here at section 3.1.2.1 of the B112. It's a lot of numbers, but that's the owner architect of record agreement, and it is the right to rely language, and it really has we've carved out certain types of information in recognition of all that we've been discussing here. Certain types of information that the architect of record can rely on, and it is things like, integration of the owner's program, aesthetic and quality standards, and the design intent. I mean, those are the things that a design architect is hired for. So those kinds of items, the architect of record can rely on. Did you get the right number of rooms in the building and the right number of beds in your schematic design? But that's a fairly limited list. The last sentence in this section 3.1.2.1 talks about the architect of record independently reviewing laws, codes, and regulations. So when it does come to making sure those egress paths are sized appropriately, that is going to fall on the architect of record to actually be responsible for double checking the work of the design architect. I know we agonized over this language quite a bit when we were editing it, and before we actually published this document, it may even change a little bit more. But any follow-up thoughts on this language and some of the ways we were thinking it through from anyone?
I will say that there was a great debate, and we have a wide representation, not just on our task group that worked on this, but within our whole documents committee. We have a lot of people and outside liaisons even reviewing this language as we develop it. And I think for some of the firms that are solely design architecture firms, they want to say, look, maybe we don't have any liability. We're just providing these concept sketches, and then, this is somebody else's responsibility to take it over. And then on the other flip side of that, there's the architects of records who are saying, well, look, wait a minute, I want to be able to rely to some extent on the information that you're giving me. I can't just, you can't be completely off the hook here. So I think what we've tried to do is really balance that and talk through the implications of both sides of who's doing what, and come to I think Chris alluded to this earlier, fair and balanced, who's really responsible for doing what, and who's got the ability to take on the risk for what the services they provided. And I think that's where this language that we ended up with kind of meets in the middle and allocates the risk to the parties where it belongs.
Yeah, and I would add to that it really starts with the E205 and what are the two architects being asked to do service-wise. And yes, the AOR is ultimately responsible, but the design architect has a skill set as well. And as we all know, as you're going through concept and as you're going through schematic, codes, health, safety, welfare, all those things are constantly playing in a tape loop in your mind as you're doing it. It's just the way the architect's mind works in my experience. But also, as we all know, projects are never finished being designed. And all the way through CDs, you're going to have little things that end up, shifting here, changing here. They might be a late development scope change on the owner's behalf. So there's a revisitation of all of these concepts, and you want the design architect to deliver as complete a package as their scope of services allows, and it should be I don't know if this is the correct term to use, but reasonably compliant with all of the codes, based on the level of development of the design, where it stands, consistent with standard of care.
And I'm just going to add one thing to that. I agree 100% with the two of you. And the design architect, no, first of all, nothing's perfect. The DA side or the AOR side, nothing's perfect. And God forbid the DA shows something on their schematic design that doesn't meet code. There's no way around it. The risk falls on the AOR. That's our, as an AOR, that's our job. And ultimately, maybe both architects take responsibility. But in the end, as Chris said, give the person who's best at handling that risk that responsibility. And in the matrix, to me, it's very, very clear who's responsible for that. In the end, that's your job. And I think this paragraph is well written. But in the end, the responsibilities fall on the parties appropriately.
One other thing I'd like to add is that I think what doesn't get talked about a lot in this delivery method is that you, as an owner, you're getting the benefit of two qualified organizations. So you have sort of baked in peer review to this. So even though it might be that, or even though it is the AOR's ultimate responsibility, I've found us going back to the DA often saying, hey, this is where we're leaning on this. I want you to opine on this. Is there maybe a better solution here? Let's work together, the three entities here, to really get the best solution for this project. And And as I've said, either in this program or maybe an earlier one, that the ability to collaborate is only heightened through this process. And as the industry trends towards that, I see this family of documents getting used a lot more and more.
I got to add, Chris, I couldn't agree more. And I think one of the largest benefits to having two architects on a project, if the owner sees fit to doing this, is that in a nutshell, you have two sets of eyes on the document. You get two sets of professional eyes on these documents. Of course, if they're blended, all the way through the project, good or bad, I think that's a great benefit for the client and the project itself.
So I want to, with the time we got remaining, I want to touch on the other topic that we were going to address in this video and fulfill that promise, which is who hires the design consultants. And I want to kind of break the design consultants into a couple of categories. And so I want to take all of those consultants that typically the owner would hire, the schedule consultant, cost consultant, geotech surveyor. The agreements that we've created, the B111, the B112, have them all as being a owner's consultant that the owner is responsible for hiring and paying. I want to set those aside for a second and talk about, because where I think the most intrigue from listening to this task group talk over the last year or so is the most intrigue is really with the structural and the MEP, the traditional design consultants that fall under the architect's purview. It seems to me like there is such a interesting way in which those, and in a varied way in which those kinds of consultants can be hired on a project, and how they can be, how those contracts can be structured. So I'll start, Tara, I'll start with you again first. As far as, can you tell us how those kinds of consultants are handled on projects that you've worked on in the past with two architects?
Sure. So that's a great question, because like all the other things we've talked about with these complex projects, it's 31 flavors. I mean, you can have a lot of different scenarios on how this works out. I will say that I think the most common from our perspective is that typically those core consultants, structure and MP&E, are hired by the AOR. And even if we're not involved, although I will say we work more in the blended model, so we don't do a lot of this hard handoff work. And so that may be a bit of a different scenario. But in the projects we've worked on, we hire them from the beginning. They may have more of a role during schematics than we do, but we are there and they are under our umbrella throughout the whole project in one consistent relationship. Now, I think there have been a few instances where it's more of a specialty project in terms of maybe a very special type of structure or structure mechanical system, that there may be a design MP&E or design engineer up front, and then it transfers to an engineer of record. And maybe the design engineer is hired by the owner versus where we then would hire the engineer of record. That doesn't happen as much in my experience as the other method.
Chris, do you have a preferred way in which these core consultants are handled on your projects?
Well, I guess there's two different types of projects. I'm probably oversimplifying that, but I'll continue with that theory for a second. When as a developer, we are competing for a certain project, whether it's a public entity or quasi-public entity, university, something like that. We will typically need to set that team up initially and carry that team all the way through. And we will have those consultants typically underneath the design professionals. However, when we're looking at in the more private sector, when we're just going through a feasibility scenario, a lot of times we'll hire that structural and the mechanical, electrical, plumbing engineers directly, just to get an understanding of what type of system is correct for this project. We will have a design architect on board handling that end of it. But we think we have a little bit more control whenever the whole concept is a little more rubbery, so to speak, until it really gets fully baked. And then we will either take the work product from those directly contracted consultants through us, whether it's a line diagram or if it's a narrative or whatever that is that we decided this is the right the right way to proceed on this project with these systems. We will either give that to the AOR to move forward with those consultants or with their own consultants and use that as owner information moving forward. It really depends on not just the project, but on the relationships that we have with the architects and the history that we may have with the consultants who they would use. Obviously, people who you have used a lot in the past, you can get a shorthand with, you can go through these feasibility phases a lot more quicker and with less cost. Not going to tip my hand with exactly how much money we spend on dead deals that never go forward, but that's part of the business, and you definitely want to minimize that till you know that you're getting some traction in the projects moving forward.
Yeah, and it will come as no surprise to anyone who looks at the B111 and the B112 that we are pretty agnostic in the creation of that document in Article 1, that we don't, in any way dictate, which party is going to be hiring which consultants. It is really a choose your own adventure. You can certainly you can arrange it in any different manner, because that's the experience that we've heard from folks, on this committee, but also when we talk to folks that were outside of this committee, when we interviewed people about how they hired consultants, and particularly these core consultants. Sal, do you have anything to add? I mean, has your experience differed with what Chris and Tara have said?
Yeah, I do have something to add. I want to look at this from a different perspective, because I personally, if we had to I know we've talked about a few benefits of having two architects. The cons are, this is one of them, the consultants, who hires them, who's responsible for them. I think this is the biggest problematic area of having two architects. So I want to look at this from a different perspective. One is just, and I'm sure Tara and Chris can agree with me, if this was a normal project, what are the factors involved when we hire consultants for ourselves? Well, one of the mitigating factors is, are we complementing each other? Can we collaborate? Do they have the same drafting formats that we have? Are they using the same software? Things like that. When an owner comes to us and says, "You're hired, but here's the consultant you're going to use," we could be lost. They could be totally different than we've ever experienced before. They might not even use the same drafting software we have for, just for a simple example. To me, the MEP is more of a risk than it is structurally. That's just some experience. And I think that we've had more issues with our MEP consultants when it's a forced marriage. Also, I think a bigger problem is when there is a transfer package where the owner had MEP consultants on board, and then we come in with our own, let's say an AOR, we bring our own consultants. And I think we'll all agree, if you took two MEP consultants and had them design something, there'd be two different answers and they're different approaches. They just look at things differently. Not that they want to be argumentative, they just don't agree. So when that situation happens, that's where we come into problems. And I think that of course causes more issues for us and more time involved. So I do think, your original question, what I'd rather see the AOR have hire the consultants right up front, be involved from the beginning or as early as possible. I think there's less problems along the project, because again, it comes down to producing the documents. But you do want somebody with really good experience that can offer that owner that information up front and do great programming and cost control. So I know there's a number of ways that they can be contracted. It's been all over the board from us. The biggest problems we had is when we were given information that we couldn't necessarily rely on from a consultant, and they weren't involved after the transfer, and we had to take the information that was handed to us and do a lot more work than we anticipated.